Muy buenos días.
Good morning. Good morning and good afternoon to everyone from Santiago, Chile. We would like to begin with this launching and press conference of the annual report issued by ECLAC, Social Panorama of Latin America and the Caribbean 2022, which is being held in a hybrid manner as from our head office in the capital of Chile. We greet the journalists that accompany us and those that are with us using the various hybrid means available. Zoom is one, the platform that is being used by our colleagues, the ECLAC website, our YouTube channel, and the social media accounts. The presentation of this document will be made by the Executive Director of the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, Mr. Jose Manuel Salazar Sirinax, and we are also accompanied by the Director of the Social Development Division of ECLAC, Alberto Arenas, the Officer Daniela Truco of that same division, the Director of the Gender Division of our organization, Ana Wessner, the Statistics Director, Rolando Campo, and from CELADE, from the Latin American and Demographic Commission, Daniel Chekim. After the presentation, there will be a Q&A session, and we remind representatives of the media to send us their questions using the chat of the Zoom platform or by email, conferenciaprensa@eclac.org. Without further ado, you have the word, Executive Secretary. Thank you very much, Guido. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to ECLAC and to the presentation of this social panorama of Latin America and the Caribbean. Perhaps I'd like to make a very short comment before we discuss these issues. First of all, the context. We are aware that this is an extremely hard moment for the world and for Latin America. We're saying that there is a crisis in cascade, several crises that have had an impact on the pandemic and that have worsened supply chains, the war in the Ukraine, the impact on inflation, the increase in interest rates, and so on. All that is a context that has worsened the social panorama. Last year's social panorama was devoted to the issue of health because of the realities of the pandemic and as a result of the health situation in the region. And this year, we are devoting this to the transformation of education as the basis for sustainable development. As you will see, there is a chapter and then other sections where we find this in addition to the general panorama on policies. We will also discuss in greater depth this tremendous impact that the pandemic has had on education, and that has extremely impacted the negative trends when it comes to education in the region. And I would like to acknowledge and certainly thank the whole team. You have all been presented. This is a report that was led by the Social Development Division, but it is a product that the whole of ECLAC has worked on because many have made a contribution. Obviously, we have a large aspect related to gender, to demographic aspects, and so on. So it is indeed a team work, and we certainly thank all colleagues that worked on this. And now to discuss this, I would like to begin with key messages, and after that, we will discuss these in greater depth. This is the context, perhaps in a little bit more detail, we have facing a long-winded social crisis, and we need to tackle that. Specifically what we call a silent crisis in education in order to prevent the very real risk of a lost generation. And therefore, we have this cascade of external shocks that has led to a slowdown of economic growth. Unfortunately, this is a slowdown that already began in 2014, 2015, and that was, of course, very negatively impacted by the pandemic. Uh, and in this post-pandemic period after 2020, which was the worst period, there has been a recovery of employment, inflation, of course, associated to the supply shock as a result of the war in the Ukraine. And all this has prolonged the and deepened the social crisis. In 2022, poverty is estimated to impact 32.1% of the population. That implies 201 million people suffering from poverty and 82 million people suffering from extreme poverty. These are figures that are over and above pre-pandemic levels. In 2021, inequality measured as a result of the Gini index decreased slightly compared to 2020. In 2020, of course, suffered multiple impacts and reached 2019 levels. But we're saying that we have to emphasize slightly here, the word slightly. A critical sequel of the pandemic is a silent impact on education as a result of the long interruption of face-to-face classes that exacerbated educational inequalities, and we'll have a look at some details of that. And this situation, and this is indeed the problem, implies a scarring effect, a long-term scarring effect that can negatively impact educational, employment, and development trajectories of a generation of children, teenagers, and young people, especially the most vulnerable. And we're not talking 3, 4, or 5 years, but rather we're talking of impacts that are lifelong impacts, because this it has been shown that whenever there is a loss of learning, that has an impact upon the employment opportunities and the income opportunities for people during their whole lives. This forms part of the general messages. The time has come for transformative, inclusive, and bold policies to move towards a strengthened welfare state. There has been a special environment here following the pandemic. We face a policy discussion that is very active in all countries. Conventional ideas have been left behind, and if one is optimistic, one can think that there are major opportunities in terms of entering into agreements for more transformative and bold policies, aware that extraordinary times require extraordinary answers. So what is it that we can do? Well, universal and sustainable social protection systems that allow for the full exercise of rights. This is a message that ECLAC has insisted upon for many years. Synergies between social protection, education, health, and labor policies. This is an issue that is fundamental. These social policy issues, such as reality, require multi-sector policies. We are not only here trying to view each one of these fields as a separate silo. Education transformation strategies have increased investment to strengthen schools, learning competencies, teaching processes, and the digital transformation of education. That is something that we will discuss in detail, and also an inclusive and transformative social policy approach that focuses on strengthening human and institutional capacities. And we'll also be talking about social expenditure in terms of the how. Well, the issue of multi-sectorial public policies for social protection and resilience. These things, let's see, when there are people suffering from vulnerability and poverty, that impacts everything. It impacts the possibility to obtain food, to go to school, and their daily lives. And this means that everything has to converge. It must include a gender approach, advancing in comprehensive public care policies and systems. We have just held a major conference in Buenos Aires with over 1,500 participants, and this conference is held every three years. And there is a full diagnosis there, which is very clear, but especially a clear vision on the importance of having care societies care networks as something which is far more wider ranging in terms of economic autonomy and decision making and policies for women, and the tremendous potential that that has. But at the same time, the great need that there is. We need to strengthen social institutions and increase the sustainability of social spending. We will look at that in detail as well, and the issue and the fact that all this implies that societies must agree in widely agreed approaches, a social pact and fiscal pact, because all this requires financing. These are the main messages of this social panorama for Latin America in 2022, and we are all aware that it is published at an extraordinarily critical moment for the region and for the world as a whole. The pandemic triggered this long-lasting social crisis. Let's begin with the issue of health. Despite the fact that the worst is over in terms of the pandemic, certainly COVID-19 death rates have declined since the beginning of 2022, and you can see the graph in blue for the whole world and in orange for Latin America and the Caribbean. And you can see that the rates are far lower than in 20 and 2021, but we still face many health challenges. There's a displacement effect generated as a result of a backlog of neglected diseases. And of course, the greatest attention was paid to caring for COVID-19, and that means that there are long waiting lists for many other illnesses, and that is a new emergency. There is uncertainty about the magnitude of the impact of prolonged COVID-19. In other words, the various sequels that patients suffer from. There is an estimated 25% increase in major mental health disorders. That is another type of pandemic. And this implies that in terms of health, there are still major challenges to deal with. Profound inequalities in terms of access to vaccines. 71.1% of the total population of the region has a complete vaccination schedule as of November 17, 2022, 74% in Latin America and 39.2% in the Caribbean. But that unequal access is indeed a pending challenge. 11 countries in the region did not reach the WHO target of 40% of the population vaccinated by the end of 2021, and 22 countries did not achieve the target of vaccinating 70% of the population by June 2022. And therefore, the issue of completing vaccinations and the issue of new variants and so on continues to be an important priority. We move from health to the labor market and employment. There was an important rebound. Considering 2021, employment has recovered, but the problem is that this has been led by the informal sector. 7 out of every 10 jobs that have been created have been in the informal sector. And therefore, these are not decent, good quality jobs, and that is a problem. We still find important gender asymmetries, and you can see a slower recovery of women's employment. The rate of jobs for women increased to 11.6, as you can see, and in terms of men, you can see the rates there. However, both rates are higher than what existed before the pandemic, and therefore, evidently, the issue of promotion, of labor insertion, of the reduction of informality is absolutely fundamental, the dynamic nature of the labor market. Inequality is another dimension of the social situation. You can see this results for 2002, 2008, 2017, and you can see a very favorable evolution of the Gini index, but it has become stagnated. In 2020, we found a drop in labor participation and employment revenues, especially in low-income sectors, as a result of confinement and all the economic impacts that had. In 2021, heterogeneous recovery of employment and household incomes, with variances per quintile. And of course, what was very important here, especially in 2020 and 2021, as a result of confinement, the increase of cash transfers implemented, and we will see how that is reflected in expenditure patterns. That is what can be of most interest and which is fundamental, the behavior of extreme poverty and poverty. They remain over and above the pandemic level. So there is a slight decrease in both 2021 compared to 2020 because of the rebound effect, the economic growth. But there is a slight increase in extreme poverty in 2022. And you can see on the left-hand side, expressed as a percentage of the total population, you can see poverty there, and also in absolute terms. And we can, if we look at this in absolute terms, 82 million people living in extreme poverty, and in 2022, 82 million, and 201 million people. And these are very concerning figures, because we find that a third part of the population suffers from this, and a tenth of the population suffer from extreme poverty. The incidence of poverty is higher in some population groups. You can see this expressed in gender terms, in terms of teenagers, boys and girls. And you can see that the poverty rate of women aged between 20 and 59 is higher than that of men in all countries of the region. Children and teenagers face a higher incidence of poverty than other age groups, and also for indigenous populations and Afro-descendants, the figures are considerably higher. So these differences are very significant. In summary, then, the pandemic generated a long-lasting social crisis that is reflected in a profound setback in key indicators of social development. The region has not yet recovered as a region from the catastrophic impact of the pandemic. In terms of extreme poverty, 13.1%, and this is a figure that we had not seen in the past. We had not seen for 25 years, and therefore this implies a 25-year setback for the region. And the projected unemployment in 2022 represents a 22-year setback, especially affecting women, for whom unemployment rises from 9.5 to 2019 to 11.6 in 2022. Let's speak about the diagnosis for. So it's very regrettable that Latin America and the Caribbean, we were the region that suffered the longest lasting crisis in education. And you can see comparisons here in terms of weeks, in terms of complete closures and partial closures of schools, partial represented in yellow, and full closures in blue, and 29 more weeks than the world average, which was 41 weeks.
Yeah. Here you can see 33 and 37 of partial and full shutdowns, and this is a situation that you can see and discuss why this happened, but it's the reality that we experienced. Uh, uh, Education continuity during those 70 weeks that was limited by access inequalities in terms of equipment or digital capabilities. In 8 out of 12 countries in the region, more than 60% of the whole population below 18 years of age does not have connectivity. More than 80%. Those are the light blue dots you see by country there. The type for 12 countries, the type of device used to access the internet also affects the continuity of education. It's not the same a mobile phone. Uh, Lots of people have a mobile phone, but it's not the same with a PC. And also, there's an issue with what is called digital uh, hoarding of digital technology. Although a household, if there's only one PC at home, and there are three children who need to be connected, and a mother and a father who need to connect as well. Of course, one connection, if it is not broadband, or if there's only one device, of course, it's insufficient. And that is, and it's an important proportion, especially in uh, poorer sectors. And of course, the lack of digital skills among students and the wider educational community. That is the possibility and the skill to use the equipment and to actually follow the educational programs. There are significant challenges for the region for the coming years and months. Also, socioeconomic level and the potential socioeconomic level and the related multiple disadvantages limit educational opportunities for young and adolescents in 12 countries in the region. There are 17 in that chart. 50% or more of children and adolescents are living in poverty. They reside in overcrowded households. The other type of overcrowded definition, which is at the base, the note, in some countries, this not only affects the poorest, but also the non-poor, low-income, and lower middle-income populations, who are the ones in brown or orange dots. So that, of course, limits the development of school errands, because if in a household there's enough space or where they can actually focus or study. And besides other issues, at all education levels, there was reduction between primary and secondary for the youngest. That dropped at 9.1% in the case of children aged 3. In primary education, attendance fell 3.8 percentage points between 19 and 20, and in secondary, 2.3 points. And in higher education, attendance fell just to 1.1%. So at the higher level of education, the lower the attendance um, reduction. And the risk of the permanent scar, the percentage of young people who not nor in paid employment rose from 22 to 28%. Here in blue, that affects more young women. 36% of them were in that position compared to 22% of young men. And once again, as I said, affects the careers and income throughout their lives. So it is really a very severe and concerning social scar. And there are measurements based on a measurement of the Caribbean secondary education certificate. The proportion of accredited students to proceed to higher education fell by 5 percentage points between 19 and 21, and that the proportion of students who obtained and who were not able to accredit themselves increased. Is not a projection anymore. Um, that in terms of education, in summary, there's so much more in the report, but if we look now or expanding this outlook, this is added to a prior crisis in terms of educational inclusion and equality. Before the pandemic in Latin America, we were experiencing learning gaps. 13 out of 16 countries in Latin America, between 50 and 94% of students with the lowest income level in quintile 1 did not achieve the minimum level of proficiency in mathematics in primary school, in red. The difference is the lowest level of proficiency between students between red and blue, in this case, from between quintile 1 and quintile 5 are significant. So, unfortunately, on average, the learning outcomes in private education did not improve from 2013 to 2019. So there was an important educational quality crisis before the pandemic, and the results, like the students, only 70% of students in fifth grade achieved minimum proficiency in math and 31 in reading. And there was progress, making progress on access to pre-primary education, but it is insufficient in pre-primary from 3 to 5 years of age. Coverage was 77.5% in 2020. The orange line on the chart, which was an increase of 22 percentage points in 20 years. That coverage was much higher than coverage for educational development programs for early childhood from 0 to 2 years, which was only 18%, which was the green line. So there are important gaps between levels or by socioeconomic levels and by territories. And once again, of course, this of course points at another dimension in education that should be faced. And finally, this affects more some population according to ethnicity. All these charts are in the document, but we didn't want to extend way too much. Uh, Indigenous students complete secondary education and students who are neither indigenous nor African descent, according to migrant children and adolescents, especially those who are unaccompanied, are disproportionately excluded from the education system. Same thing with people with disabilities. The average years of schooling of the adult population is 10 years compared to less than 7 for the population with disabilities. And the early marriage and adolescent motherhood is tragic as well in the region. 1 out of 5 women from 20 to 24 years entered into child marriage or early union before the age of 18. These percentages increase among disadvantaged groups. Mothers with one child or unions between the ages of 14 to 17 years record much lower attendance rates than young women without children or who are not in early unions. So the proportion of early unions and adolescent motherhood and what to do in that respect. In all levels, there are gaps in education, or in spite of the progress regarding differences between men and women. This is the um, here we have the participation of women in education above the line around 1 means that there's more women's participation than men's participation, but there's a clear pattern of gender segregation by discipline that begins to appear at the basic education level. On average, female students do not perform as well in math and science in primary education, and these disparities are worsening the lowest income quintiles. Um, Specifically in higher education, there are wider gender gaps in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, STEM. There's a significant gender segregation in higher education. So we present in this outlook that this crisis is an opportunity to transform education because it has deepened. It is such a serious situation. Societies should build consensus and to have the political will to develop the necessary actions that are required. What we did in the document was to align the conceptual framework of the objectives as well as the action lines that you're going to see 5 with the discussion, the very powerful discussion at the summit. The summit for transforming education within the framework of the United Nations General Assembly in September, last September. In the document that was presented by the General Secretary, you find these overarching objectives, the overarching objectives of educational transformation, which are important to read. There's something deep, very philosophical as well. There are 4 main overarching objectives to learn, which is to equip each student with key cognitive and socio-emotional skills for the 21st century. Early education is crucial. UNESCO and United Nations organizations evidence shows that learning to learning to live together is so important to prepare students to become active and responsible citizens with respect to diversity, solidarity, and nature, and to help create a culture of peace. Learning to do ensure continuous learning with a focus on training and retraining, digital literacy, and financial and STEM skills. Learning to do because you study to be an educated individual. There's a whole humanistic philosophy and behind education, but people study also to get a good job and to contribute to society productively. And also learning to be, which is to instill the values, knowledge, and skills They needed to enjoy and live a meaningful, dignified, and fulfilling life. Very powerful, very interesting in terms of major objectives and educational philosophy. But connecting this with the diagnostic of the situation, with these overarching objectives, it gives us 5 action lines. And this is what we use to organize the recommendations that we have in this outlook. So, action track 1, inclusive, equitable, safe, and healthy schools. That includes investing more in early childhood, universalized secondary education. There are several countries that have extremely low rates or very high levels of unattendance, or lower rates of education, harmonized education with other policy sectors. What we said, multi-sector, this is not only education, it has to do with health, transportation, protection of household income, care, all that is related to, and also eroding the dismantle the structural challenges of gender equality, eliminate gender stereotypes. Cultural aspects are so important in this, including the gender perspective, with a focus on the digital gender divide, fostering gender equality in STEM. There's something that we saw in the diagnostics, the action track 2, learning and skills for life, work and sustainable development, developing cognitive and socio-emotional skills, in all of the new methodologies that are used for that, strengthening higher education as the backbone of a policy of inclusion and sustainable development. And all of this about encouraging education through the life cycle, which is the new philosophy and vision about how this should be done, because the world is changing fast, and the paradigm that we used to go to primary school, then secondary school, and then we would graduate, and then you would work 30 years. That it's not the case. It's a training and retraining and continuous learning, and we need to reinvent ourselves for a changing labor world. Action track 3, teachers, the teaching and the teaching profession, enable teachers to reinvent themselves as change agents. Of course, the teacher body is the base, is where the interaction takes place with the students and learning. And so the quality of the training and empowerment of teachers. They are knowledge producers, facilitators, and guides for understanding complex realities, and even for inspiration of students at different levels. Number 4 is digital learning and transformation. Of course, all the conversation about digital gaps and divides. We talk about the 3 C's: connectivity, narrowing infrastructure and equipment gaps, capacities, advancing in digital transformation of learning that needs digital skills in among parents, students, and the teachers, and content, incentivizing development of platforms and content. And finally, action track 5, investing more and more fairly and more efficiently in education. It's a whole issue of what are the investment percentages, the investment that is taking place, the percentages that go to primary, secondary, and college education depends on each country. This is a very important discussion. Also, in terms of rural areas versus urban areas, either including or excluding indigenous populations, minorities, and Afro descendants, in all the topic of efficiency in spending. Although we have comparisons with the OECD in terms of expenditure, but this is not only about the amounts as a percentage of GDP, but the efficiency with which the resources are being used. So here we go back again, once again, a major focus on education. Now we expand to the social context in terms of the social institutional framework and social spending. These are 2 key dimensions. So the social institutional framework is to say, what are the institutions in charge? What is their policies? It's key for social policy making. So we talked about the fact that the strengthening of that institution is a key, and involves 4 major dimensions. The legal and regulatory dimension with adequate frameworks that guide the purposes and principles of policies. In some countries, these aspects are not key, are not clear, but it's fragmented. There's also an organizational dimension with clear mandates and coordination, technical and operational dimension for the effective implementation of policies. And all of this, the whole issue now that with new technologies, and data analysis, big data, so social policies with accuracy, they are possible in countries that have made significant progress in benefiting and not to identify the beneficiaries with various information systems and also to make payments and so. And of course, the financial dimension with sufficient and sustainable resources that enable equality social policies and the investment amounts. Financial topic now that is full of dangers because after this cascading crisis and with the fiscal spending efforts that have been made, the fiscal space in many countries is quite restricted.
The issue of the financial restrictions, of the fact that fiscal budgets are able to maintain social expenditure is important. And here we have social expenditure that represented 13% of the GDP in 2021, lower than 2020. In 2020, we had a tremendous expansion of the expenditure, in partly as a result of expenditure in health, but also because of social transfers in order to compensate for the tremendous drop in income in many sectors of the population. Many countries introduced programs with different names or bonds with different names for non-conditioned cash transfer programs. But if we analyze between 20 and 21, there was a decrease by an average of 0.8 percentage points of the GDP between 20 and 2021. In other words, that major expansion in 2020 was slowed down in 2021, and it decreased it in terms of the share of total spending from 55.7% in 2020 to 24.5% in 2021. But we still face a challenge of providing financial sustainability to social expenditure because the needs indeed exist. And this is data for the Caribbean. In the Caribbean, the expenditure increased by an average of 0.4% of the GDP, and the social spending reached 4.1% of the GDP in 2021, greater than in the rest of Latin America. But there is still a lower share than of the Latin American countries, and there's a whole series of other data there. We still find a tremendous heterogeneity of spending among countries and sub-regions. Some are over and above 17%, and others do not reach 10%. And you can see the different groups of countries on the graph. The Caribbean countries are on the right-hand side. South America is the sub-region with the highest average social spending, which represents 15.3% of the GDP, and the greatest heterogeneity. In Central America, Mexico and the Dominican Republic on average represented 10.5% of the GDP, and in the Caribbean 14.1%. And you can see the per capita figures there, which are interesting. In South America, $1,529 US, 2.1 times the per capita expenditure of Central America, Mexico, and the Dominican Republic, which is $745 US. And in the Caribbean, it's far greater. It is $2,140 per capita, which is the highest average per capita social spending in the region. And in order to conclude, we go back to the general outlook and to the recommendations. We have not been able to revert the impact of the pandemic, and therefore countries face a silent crisis in education, and that may impact the future of new generations. And that is what is at risk. Despite the progress made in recent decades, the region was deeply indebted in terms of social inclusion and the quality of education prior to the COVID-19 crisis. Investing in education is a key aspect. We have the issue of inequality, health and education, but education is fundamental for social mobility, growth, reduction of inequality, and so on. It is important to ensure face-to-face education without leaving anyone behind. And there are a whole series of actions there to restore the socio-emotional well-being of educational communities, to re-engage students who dropped out of school, to evaluate and recover learning, and so on and so forth. And finally, the issue that we are facing, that cascade of crises, and we can refer to that during the Q&A session. to look at prospects for looking at 2023. The transformation of education is imperative, both for the medium and long term, and we need intersectoral efforts. We cannot continue to undertake public policy as we have always done. What is also very important is to promote the participation of women in dynamic sectors of the economy, moving towards this concept of the society of care with gender equality. And there is a revised action plan, which is very powerful, and that came out of the meeting held organized by the Gender Division and UN Women, the meeting held recently in Buenos Aires, and the issue of social covenants accompanied by fiscal contracts. Thank you very much for your attention, and we look forward to your questions. Thank you, Executive Secretary. This is the presentation of the social panorama of Latin America and the Caribbean, the annual report for 2022. We will answer the first block of questions that we have received via the chat, and which is being followed virtually by colleagues, and also received in our email address in the first block of questions. Executive Secretary, I would like to share with you the concern of Paulina Abramovich from France press agency here in Santiago. And her question is the following. The region has not recovered the pre-pandemic poverty index, and we foresee a slowdown for next year. What measures could be undertaken by Latin American governments to face up to this growth of poverty? And there is also a question from Interpress Service, Orlando Milesi, and he asks two questions. He says, in order to urgently cater for 18.5% of young people younger than 18 or that live in poverty, what measures are a priority for governments? Are we only talking of bonds or immediate support or longer lasting support? And he also asks whether the crisis has revealed whether it's possible that it's not possible to go back to traditional teaching methods, but rather improve quality and teaching methods, and that would improve living conditions of poorer people. It is estimated that the annual cost to guarantee a digital basket would be 18.5% of the GDP in accordance with some of the countries that have been analyzed. There is awareness of the tremendous implication of investing those resources. Are there examples to be followed? And in this third block, Yvette Saldaña from Universal of Mexico, who asks, the mere fact of transferring cash to the poorer in Mexico reduces poverty, or should other elements be taken into consideration with this same purpose, the reduction of poverty? And so, with the questions of Yvette Saldaña of Universal and of the other two journalists, you have the floor, Executive Secretary. Thank you. These are fundamental questions, and I sincerely thank you for that. In terms of which additional measures should be adopted by Latin American governments, I would like to begin by saying that in the short term, poverty is extremely related to two major dimensions or issues: the rate of economic growth and the level of inflation. Greater growth is associated to the generation of employment, to a more dynamic labor market, increase in income, and a mediocre growth is not a growth that creates much employment and does not generate virtuous circles or cycles, and therefore whatever can promote economic reactivation, especially in intensive employment sectors. Let's think of tourism, construction, agricultural sectors, some services sectors, and so on. These are all measures that help the reduction of poverty in the short term, and are not relies on each issue, of course, on each sector. There is a fundamental issue, which is credits for SMEs, because they represent a very, very high percentage of employment, and therefore we have economic reactivation. Inflation is another issue, and inflation is one of the worst taxes that exist in metaphorical terms, because they erode the purchasing power of people, and especially of the poor, where we have found an inflation of food products that has an impact upon the cost of the basic basket. So everything that has to do with the control of inflation is fundamental. And a third set of measures, and this is a whole package, of course, proposed by ECLAC in order to face to this long-lasting crisis, going beyond the reactivation and the control of inflation, is inclusive and transformative social policies. And this includes much of what we have been mentioning, to increase in the short term or to implement revenue protection. And this can include mechanisms such as to include increased coverage, monetary transfers, cash transfers, conditioned and not conditioned. And there is a discussion in countries about whether there is fiscal capability in order to institutionalize a basic emergency income policies that enable to guarantee levels of income. What is also a priority is to prevent school dropouts and make children return to schools, and also have actions in order to safeguard food security. That is a major issue. Together with the FAO, we will soon be launching a policy brief about the challenge of food security and a plan on how to improve that. And we also need to strengthen in the midterm universal and integral and resilient social protection systems. This is a fundamental issue. The whole discussion of social policies, there are tremendous weaknesses in welfare states in Latin American countries. Be it that we talk about pension coverage, the insufficiency of pensions, and so on. We also have the issue of health, what we have already mentioned, in the sense that it is important. Well, this has not, the health emergency is not completely over. The pandemic has shown that we have a tremendous diversity in terms of the weaknesses and strengths of the health systems, and we need to consolidate pension systems. There is still a trend, and Simonis Chine is here from CELADE, which is the Latin American demography center, where we find clear signs of the aging of the population, and that implies that in upcoming years there will be an increasing challenge of providing more decent pensions in terms of coverage and in terms of the amount and amounts paid, and likewise the care society will also be changing from the care of children to the care of the older population. And therefore, we emphasize in the panorama the importance of the institutional framework, the importance of not taking steps back when it comes to social spending, and the fiscal measures in order to adequately finance all this. In summary, I would say that in order to answer this question, that the basic package of measures involves economic recovery, control and reduction of inflation, and social and inclusive labor programs that are also transformative. That in the short term. In the long term, we'll find other issues, but I don't want to make this issue more complex, because in the long term, we find a productive development. That issue, we cannot continue with these mediocre growth rates that Latin America has.
Orlando Milesi.
The other question from Mr. Milesi about what to do to tend to the 18% of those who live under extreme poverty and 45% that are poor below 18 years of age. Well, the quick answer is that two things are needed. Multi-sectorial long-term policies, that is a representation of children and adolescents. That's a structural phenomenon in the region that require priority attention. And of course, this is a concern that is increased by this significant inflation rates. So as we said in this social outlook, and ECLAC has been saying it, it is a time to consolidate inclusive, transformative social policies that bet on institutional and human capabilities and to make progress towards strengthened welfare states. And that includes the policies that I mentioned in the short and medium term. This is a situation, a structured situation. There are different options to increase, to raise income, even through universal transfers to these boys, girls, and adolescents and their families, and other potential benefits. The region has experienced lots of relevant experience in terms of 2 decades of conditioned and non-conditioned transfer. So the idea is to build on those best practices from the past, the issue of food security for boys, girls, and adolescents. So I would say that that is the main aspect. The third question from Yvette Saldaña, El Universal de México, about providing cash transfers to the poorest. Does it reduce poverty? Another element to consider to make progress towards the same objective. Well, one of the key lessons from this pandemic is the importance and the value of cash transfers that made a significant difference. Of course, that support in the short term, especially when the governments and the states were telling people to stay at home with confinement and everything, lockdown. So there was no option. There were significant inequalities that expressed because there were several people, especially informal people, who make money like working every single day, and that created inequality because, of course, qualified workers who could do remote work, staying at home with a broadband connection and a PC, they could continue to work simply with almost the same productivity. But it wasn't the case for a vast majority of people who depend on manual work and who do not work online. So those transfers are key. And I think it is a lesson that this pandemic taught us, and not only makes a difference that the pandemic helped those transfers, and even people actually having access to banking systems. Not only systems were improved in order to identify people, but in order to provide them with cash transfers to their individual accounts. There's impressive data in terms of how many people were able to have access to the banking system, and people who were able to receive that money even through their mobile phones. So this is a deep discussion regarding government transfers are conceived as rights, and that's why we hear a lot about having basic social protection levels. There's a discussion in terms of how to do it and how to fund it. And that is important, and that is part of the solutions for the future. This is clear in Mexico because during the pandemic, the only social group in Mexico in which poverty was reduced was among senior citizens, and mainly due to universal care for senior citizens. Direct cash transfers are not the solution, but they are part of the solution. That should also include basic income, better income distribution, and universal provision and public provision of education, healthcare, and care. There's a whole discussion in terms of how many of those services can be provided privately or publicly. That is a huge discussion. I believe from ECLAC's point of view, the vision is that it is important that should be a public policy, is part of the social compact of our societies. Besides, Mexico has made progress in terms of gender equality towards parity in many positions in the public policy making, and also statistics based on gender. So there's a huge opportunity to invest on economic autonomy of women, especially those that are overrepresented in the case of poor households. That's why ECLAC has called to drive affirmative actions to substantial increase. That was one of the big message of the conference that I mentioned. and the action plan derived from it, and the driver to the full, meaningful participation of women in economy.
Muchísimas gracias, secretario ejecutivo. Vamos a aprovechar que hay...
Since there are some colleagues who are present here in the room who could possibly ask their questions live. If anyone would like to ask a question, you'd be welcome. Please raise your hand. Okay. Let's start, if you allow me. Amanda Santillan from Diario Financiero, and then Carmen Esquivel from Prensa Latina. They're both asking for the chance to ask a question. Please, Amanda, if you please.
Hola, me gustaría...
I'd like to ask you, what is the poverty forecast and extreme poverty for Chile in 2022, and what factors have had an impact on the poverty in this country?
Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you, Amanda, the Executive Secretary. Yes, since it's very specific about figures, I believe, Rolando, maybe you should answer. Thank you, Executive Secretary. For Chile, we have data of the CACEN survey for 2020, and the data reflected a poverty estimate of 14.2% and extreme poverty of 4.5%. We, as you know, 2021, this survey was not done. It's about to be organized now, but according to the forecasts that we have made, there could be some downward adjustments for 2021 and 2022. However, for 2021 is a reduced forecast with the permanence of that reduction in 2022, so there would not be difference of poverty between 2021 and 2022, and this is due to mainly the transfer level of 2021 in Chile is the highest, so we clearly see a spike compared to all the other countries in the South Cone in Latin America.
Muchísimas gracias, Rolando Campo, director.
Thank you, Mr. Rolando Campo, Head of Statistics Division. Prensa Latina, you had asked for the floor. Carmen. Yes, good morning. I wanted to ask ECLAC. ECLAC depicts a very complicated outlook for this year and next year with a decrease of 1.4%. What perspective do you have? What is the outlook for ECLAC Latin America? When could we start seeing recovery from the COVID-19 crisis and also the international crisis that is happening now? And what is the impact of this economic situation in Latin America today on the fulfillment of the 2030 agenda by the United Nations? Thank you, Carmen Esquivel from Prensa Latina. Executive Secretary, you have the floor. Thank you, Carmen, for your question. It is key, of course. So we, for 2023, we have an estimate or a forecast that growth is going to be 1.4. Before it was 3.2. So in terms of growth, unfortunately, these are not good news at all. Why that low growth? Well, it's a mix of internal factors in the countries, uncertainty, fiscal limitations, but it's also a slowdown, economic slowdown in the world. The United States, which is one of the most important business partners for the region, will only grow 1%. Europe will only grow 0.5%. That is the average for the Eurozone. Some of the countries will undergo a recession. In Europe also, it's an important business partner. And China will grow 4.7. Those are the estimates. That is a low growth for what the historical experience is with China. So China is not going to be the giant buyer of primary products that there used to be when it was growing at 8 or 9%. So in terms of growth, we see a difficult year. There are certain things, and not all, it's all about the it would be great to have an international economy that would cause exports to be very dynamic in our countries. There are some dynamic sectors, e-commerce and exports have interesting trajectories. Well, there's a lot that countries can do locally, so that growth
como mencioné, construcción, vivienda, turismo, tiene una gran recuperación.
so that different sectors can show growth. Countries in the Caribbean have shown good examples. In many cases, tourism, depending on the country, is a very broad supply chain because it covers many small hotels and small businesses. Now, where it may be, or what is reasonable to expect, some positive news without having crystal ball, but there are some indicators, is the area of inflation and interest rates, in the sense that there are some prices of commodities or products that are rebounding because they are undergoing a stabilization, like oil prices. The worst is behind us, I think. So in terms of energy, specifically oil, that is an important impact because there's a huge impact, and also food products. The question is when central banks will be able to lower the monetary rates or the Federal Reserve, in the light of that behavior of what this inflation was mainly caused by the supply shock of these products. One could expect that there would be a change in this trend of raising interest rates. No, but this is not a crystal ball. There could be black swans and new surprises, but in that scenario, there's reason to think that we could expect good news in the inflation area. So it's interesting because most of this inflation is affecting the world. And I close by saying something about inflation, because with low inflation, 4, 5, 6%, below 10, there's no compared to when a country has a 30, 40, 50% inflation, although these supply factors, so the factors that initially may have generated an inflation process, may have disappeared. So there's some change in behavior of prices and labor markets that change the situation. It is harder for countries that have relatively high inflations to control inflation compared to when inflations are not more than 2 digits.
And SDGs. In terms of SDGs, well, unfortunately, the pandemic and all this data that we have presented in the social panorama implies tremendous obstacles and setbacks. These are not good news for practically no single SDG. And in that sense, we're already beginning to prepare the documentation, the monitoring, the follow-up, and ECLAC plays a fundamental role in this, working hand in hand with governments to produce, generate, and publish that information. We will have a Sustainable Development Forum in April of next year, during which we will present a report on the progress or not with empirical data broken down per SDGs, and also an institutional report in terms of how countries have organized themselves in order to achieve their SDGs. Obviously, this long-winded social crisis, and this economic slowdown is not good news for 2030. Thank you, Executive Secretary. And now we will mention a new block of questions that have been received. First of all, the concern shared by the correspondent of EFE, Maria Martinez Moore, and she asks, well, inflation is impoverishing the population even more. Which countries have an increase of poverty as a result of an increase in prices? And supplements that with the following concern: if inequality is not stopped, can you envisage new social expressions in the region, or do you feel that the progressive governments in this continent can contain these protests? And I would also like to share a concern of Silvia Rodriguez from Mexico, and she asked the impact of inflation on poverty levels in Mexico, and if we evidence a setback in educational terms as a result of a pandemic, how long will it take to recover from that? And what are the actions that could be undertaken? And finally, in this block of questions, I share the concern of our colleague Patricia Leighton from La Nación of Costa Rica. And she says, before the pandemic, Costa Rica was one of the most unequal countries in the region. And I suppose that it is still in that position. What are the reasons why Costa Rica is in this position, and what are the public policy proposals to reduce these gaps? And with these concerns from Mexico and from Costa Rica, you have the floor. Executive Secretary. Well, thank you very much. With regards to the question asked by Maria Martinez Moore, indeed, the social panorama highlights the increase of inflation levels as a very relevant factor, especially in 2021, but also in 2022. Let us remember that considering that the inflation rate after 12 months in the region was below 12% at the beginning of 2020, we had long periods of very low inflation that increased to 6.6% in December 2021 and increased to 8.5% in 2022. This increase in price levels was the result of two aspects: food and energy. By the end of 2021, food inflation in the region was 7.4%, and in the following year it increased to practically 12%. And given the great share of the price of food, well, it is the poorest that are hardest hit as a result of this process. When we look at information available to date, we find a drop in real remunerations in several countries, but also a recovery as a result of the rebound effect in 2021 of the number of people that are employed. And therefore, if we take into consideration these two effects, inflation and a slight increase of employment, despite the fact that a lot of it is informal, we find that an important group of countries do not evidence significant changes in terms of poverty for the coming year.
Bueno,
in terms of inequality, this is a structural burden, as we know, that was present before this cascade of crisis, but became much more acute, as we have outlined during the presentation and in the report. What has also become much worse is social unrest as a result of inequality, but not only because of that, but also because of the issue of poverty. This is also related to dissatisfaction in economic the situation and the institutional weakening in some aspects, and that in many countries has, and this is viewed in surveys, in feelings of mistrust, and that has also been expressed violently in the streets in many countries. So Latin America, before the pandemic, it was already facing a pattern of the weakening of social cohesion and certain fractures in terms of the social covenant, or when a large part of the citizens, in terms of education, health, employment, their expectations were simply not being met. And this not only for the poor, but also for the middle class that expected to improve and to have an upward social mobility. For many years, ECLAC has insisted on these risks and dangers. It has spoken about catering for those aspects, social protection systems that enable us to face these risks. And that is why we mentioned the importance of strengthening welfare states. That is translated into very concrete aspects in terms of improving the social covenant, budget allocations, catering for the social groups that are falling behind. And that implies, as we say in the last chapter of this report, it implies improving the institutional framework of social policies. But also, not everything is social expenditure and institutional framework, but it has to do with productive development, employment opportunities, growth, and therefore the issue of economic productive growth patterns. And there again, we go back to the issue of education, which is fundamental. If one looks at this in the long term, the countries that have invested most in education, or let's express it in other words, so that the high performance countries in Asia and in Latin America are the countries that have invested heavily in education and human talent. And that is the way to achieve social mobility, because those that invest in talent, well, that is where the local investment and foreign investment seek greater opportunities. The technological revolution today implies that many of the direct foreign investment flows go not so much to blue collar, cheap labor, but rather there is investment now that seek destinations where there is human talent and educational institutions that can very quickly train people. And therefore, again, the issue of investment in education is fundamental. So those are the tasks that Latin America has to take on board if we want to do away with episodes of social discontent. People must feel that there is investment in education, that there is social mobility opportunities, that there's an investment in education, and of course an investment also in health. The question by Silvio Rodriguez in terms of the impact of inflation on poverty and inequality in Mexico. Well, the estimations of poverty and extreme poverty, both official statistics and ECLAC statistics, are based on the expenditure and revenues survey by INEGI, and therefore the latest estimations refer to 2020, and there are various elements there, context elements that lead us to project a poverty reduction in 2022 compared to 2020 of at least 2 percentage points. Despite the fact that the price of the basic food basket has increased by 9.4% in urban areas and 9.7% in rural areas. So the increase of the minimum salary of 22% in January of this year, and of the mean salary of employers associated to the Mexican Institute of Social Security, has been able to contain that increase of poverty in accordance with the National Council to Innovate Social Policy. Labor poverty was around 40% during the first quarter of 2022, 1.6% less than the average of that same quarter in 2020, which was 41.5, and 0.8% less than in 2021. which was 40.7%. That is the specific data. And if I need to be corrected, please do so. Now, as a result of the pandemic, there was also a setback in education in Mexico. How long will it take to recover that? And what will be the actions for that? Well, the panorama that we presented evidence that Latin America is the country with the biggest damage to education in terms of weeks lost. And that, of course, led to many inequalities. What we are warning today and what we have been saying is that unless we implement urgent recovery measures, we will suffer from a very costly scar, not only for young people, but also in terms of growth, social cohesion in Latin America in the future. Now, this impacts all dimensions. Now, talking about Mexico, the fact that Mexico is one of the countries that took longest to return to face-to-face classes, well, that had a tremendous impact on education, especially in sectors that had no virtual connection. And that is why it is fundamental to go back to school, to face-to-face classes. And I have mentioned the recommendations, and there are additional details in the report, and which includes a whole list of things that we believe are essential, not only in Mexico, but in other countries also. And finally, the question by Patricia Leighton from newspaper La Nación of Costa Rica. Costa Rica before the pandemic was one of the most unequal countries. And what are the reasons for that? And what are the possible proposals? Well, here we would have to say that more than a deterioration, what we have found in Costa Rica is a stagnation of inequality, or a stagnation in the improvement of inequalities. Costa Rica experienced an impressive recovery in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. In the 80s, it was a little bit less so because of the debt crisis, but that improvement has become stagnated. The richest decile receives 87% of the national revenue, and and the lowest decile receives a very slow percentage, and that has remained very stable. And between 2022 and 2014, there was a tremendous growth in many countries. The Gini index in 2022, however, was 0.49, very similar to that of 2014, which was 0.498, and very close to that of 2020, which is 0.50. When we talking about stagnation, there are slight movements in the Gini index, but which does not increase, and that is of concern to a lot of the population, because the growth of the middle class and of lower income groups were accustomed to a development pattern where they were improving every decade, and children could be better off than their parents, and that has become more difficult lately. This lack of change has meant that Costa Rica has become the second country with less inequality at the beginning of the decade of the 2000s to one of the first to the five most unequal countries. Costa Rica has become stagnated, and therefore in that ranking, their situation has worsened significantly. There are at least two factors that were produced and that explain this. One is an improvement in labor revenues per employed person as a result of a progressive improvement of education and the reduction of salary gaps between more or less qualified workers. But in Costa Rica, there has been a deterioration in the educational system. The educational system, which was a system for social inclusion, is no longer what it was in the past. And there the country has a very serious issue.
And cash transfers that accounted for a significant part of the income. There was an important expansion during the pandemic, but that has changed recently because there's a significant fiscal restrictions. Also, it's a country, and in the discussion, and there's diagnostic about a country in which these public sector salaries and pension systems, there's a number of pension systems that are special, that became extremely generous for some groups, whereas the pension systems for the majorities and the Social Security is characterized by insufficient pensions in many cases, and also a lack of coverage in many cases as well. There's also an element of a tax structure that is not progressive nor regressive, which is yet another element that contributes. And I would also mention, and from ECLAC, we see it clearly that there's been a very successful country in developing high technology systems that demand qualified workers with high salaries, what we just before. But this is a workforce which is a relatively small percentage of the total workforce. So that is a productive structure that this medical devices sectors, for example, modern services exports, and many other sectors like those. But this is the biased technology change, but it's biased towards high qualification, which is modifying salary structures. And finally, in many of these modern sectors, that success has been geographically focused in Costa Rica, in the metropolitan area, and there's been a lower impact on the territories outside the metropolitan areas. So there's a territorial imbalance. So, in spite of having one of the most developed welfare states in the region, Costa Rica has had difficulties because of these factors. To conclude here, it is important, that's why this integrated approach that we promote in ECLAC, that of course to focus on the income redistribution, welfare states, and social policy. But let's not forget that maybe the biggest source of improvement in the income distribution is a dynamic labor market with opportunities for the vast majorities, and also that relies on education and investment. So that integrated productive development, then social policy, that is the north that we need to aim at. In the case of Costa Rica, it's a key example of the truth of what I'm saying. Thank you very much, Executive Secretary. Finally, we're going to take the last few questions, which doesn't mean that we of course are going to keep receiving many questions that we're going to answer in writing to our colleagues that have sent them. This last set, Executive Secretary, let me read for you questions sent by Natalia Ramos, Reuters correspondent, who asks the following. Regarding the silent education crisis and considering the economic perspectives that are quite disheartening, how many years would it take to recover what's been lost? And have you done a survey of those countries that are greatly affected by this? How do you understand the case of Chile, whose economy recovered after the pandemic, while the educational system is undergoing an extreme educational crisis with violence and lack of attendance? Ms. Bastias from ANSA. Question: what do you mean by a social institutionality is a critical factor for social policy effectiveness and an element that cuts across the board to achieve inclusive social growth? And the report says that there's no room for moderate social policies, but how you combine that if in the economic report the request is to take care of fiscal balances? And finally, this final set of questions, Rocío Montes from El País, Spain. Her question: how much has the gender gap grown after the pandemic, and what are the strategies recommended to governments and states to shorten that gap? So Natalia Ramos from Reuters, Rita Bastias from ANSA, and Rocío Montes from El País. Executive Secretary, you have the floor.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. Well, Natalia Ramos' question, and since it's from Chile, I'd like to offer the floor to
Perfecto, muchas gracias, secretario.
Thank you, Secretary, and answering Natalia Ramos on the silent education crisis. Well, among the main impacts of pandemic on education are the learning setbacks, the risk of mental health problems, which is part of that silence in uh, after the pandemic in boys, girls, and adolescents. And all these inclusion issues in education are not only related to this crisis, but of course, they come from before. And this means that the pandemic, or what we have called this silent education crisis, is to worsen these issues. And there are different public institutions and think tanks that have described the important increase of students that have stopped attending school. That means that they only attend 85% or of the total number of school days in all levels of education, from pre-primary to secondary education in Chile. And recently, as the executive secretary presented the impacts on performance in the Caribbean, for example. Recently, there's a study from the World Bank that provides statistical simulations for Latin America and the Caribbean. And in this region would have lost between 1 and 1.8 years of schooling adjusted by learning. And that is a significant impact. And how, if we have done a survey of the region of the countries, and how can this be understood in the case of Chile, we could mention that basically we could highlight in the region some countries. The first thing would be to say that closing schools, as the secretary said, the region experienced the largest closure of schools in the world, 70 weeks of closure. And this closure of schools especially creates effects on learning and uh, other risks. So we look at statistics of the countries during this closure. Ecuador and Bolivia, for example, they have 20 weeks more than the average for the region, so they're close to 90 weeks of school closure. And this is quite concerning because obviously this generates an impact on learning levels, as well as these countries have problems of low productivity. And so it is an even bigger impact. And the third country that we highlight in that sense is El Salvador, that kept its schools closed for 18 weeks more than the average of the region, with the clear evidence of these three countries, as I said before, the pandemic. And in Chile, back to school meant there have been different situations, and in that context, the one that is quite contingent has to do with violence in schools, where pandemic is not the cause of these violence, but it may be considered as the trigger of the increased violence that has been experienced. And some elements that may help explain this increased violence in educational establishments, just to mention, is the limitation in the social educational skills, the poor management of mental health issues, the exponential increase of online activities without it having adequate mediation. And in that context, it is important the face-to-face education comeback is should focus on initiatives focused on socio-emotional well-being of the community, as well as of supporting the teachers and strengthening the articulation of the different sectors in terms of public policy, of what's going on in education, like, for example, in terms of mental health, healthcare, and issues related to social protection. That would be regarding Natalia Ramos' question. Thank you, Victoriana's head of the Social Development Division at ECLAC, Executive Secretary. So Margarita Bastia's question from ANSA now regarding the social institutional arrangement. Yes, What do we mean by saying that social institutionality is a critical factor in all of this? Um, Together with social spending, of course. Well, that means that in reality, if we look at the experience in terms of social policy in other areas, many times in Latin America, we say that we experience fluctuations or volatility or very radical changes from one administration to the next, and that we need a more state-wide policies. But if we look at the experience empirically, in fact, the countries that have had state policies in different fields with continuity, with sound institutional framework, institutions that have databases that know the topics and with operational and technical capabilities. So even though authorities may come and go, but there's a whole legal regulatory context and a vision, a number of plans that may be specific or more general that add continuity. So that is one dimension, important dimension, because institutional framework is critical and the operational capabilities are key as well in terms of social policy. It's also key to consider regulatory aspects because usually in social aspects there are so many dimensions, so many programs. Some of them are specific, others that are universal, healthcare, education, and gender, women, and other vulnerable groups, food programs. So there's a variety of this. So we have an institutional framework that it can be consistent in terms of the actions, being able to correct the direction and to negotiate the budgets, of course, that are necessary with the finance ministries, and ministers of economics. The pandemic, in fact, is a major example of that. The importance of the institutional framework in the world, in the region, we see that the countries that had a social and health institutional framework were strong, were able to respond. So resilience is another important concept. That is why countries have developed preparation plans to face natural disasters. The same thing with pandemic shocks or any other uh, disturbance we are experiencing this moment in the country. So there's another function there of this institutional arrangement, which is key for public policies. And that is part of the social compact. And the other part of the question is that there's no room for moderate social policies. That means that they need to be ambitious. This is what we mean, how to fit that with a limited fiscal space. Well, sometimes uh, it's hard to deal with this. So something to make something desirable, but it's difficult to fund. It doesn't mean that it's still desirable. We are saying that there are a number of things that and we should make an effort to reach that. And of course, there are certain things that when there's a political will and agreement to do, you need to find the resources to be able to do it when that can become a priority. So it's also an issue of discussion, priority, and the vision of each administration in balance with other groups. We see countries in Latin America that even with this slowing down of the economy or with the situation that is so complicated are still successfully negotiating some additional tax income. 1.5% of the GDP in Colombia has just passed a tax reform in that sense. So that's great because much of that is going to help expand the fiscal space that is needed for these things that we are discussing. But we know that that discussion maybe is the most complex discussion that needs to be take place in the social compact, because that not only requires political knowledge, but because it is what is being received for the taxes that are paid as good services in many of our countries. There are examples that services are not of high quality or they are not received fully. So that is the policy economy and the fiscal compact. That it doesn't take away validity to what we are saying in the sense that there is a number of things that are desirable. We need to find a way of funding.
And with regards to the question of how much about the question on the gender gap, maybe Anna, you could answer that. Thank you, Executive Secretary. I would like to greet Rocio Mondes, who is a correspondent from El País. What we have been showing in the social panorama and in the different ECLAC documents is that the cascade of crises have deepened gender inequalities in the region. Socioeconomic inequality and poverty uh, have worsened with the massive expulsion of women from the workforce and the strong increase of unemployment. We have observed a major setback in the economic autonomy of women. For example, in 2021, the recovery of employment was also unequal. It is slower, as has been mentioned by the executive secretary, and is also mentioned in the report. And today, 1 out of every 2 women in the region is outside the labor force. In the case of men, it's 1 out of every 4. And this has to do with the fact that women focus on the sectors that were most strongly impacted by the pandemic: tourism, manufacturers, trade, remunerated domestic work, and also because they were tremendously impacted by the demand for care. We cannot forget that in this region, that and in this region, 23 countries value the use of time, and we're showing that with the statistics division, women devote 3 times the amount of hours to non-remunerated care. And this implies a contribution of between 16 and 27% of the GDP of countries. In other words, women are bearing upon their shoulders a large part of the effort in terms of containing these crises. 74% of this work is undertaken by women. And this is done in a condition where we are not benefiting from a profound gender bonus. The report shows that this was a region that made tremendous progress in terms of educational parity. In fact, with household ECLAC household surveys by 2020, 27% of women aged between 25 and 59 years have 13 or more years of schooling, compared to 23.3% in the case of men. In other words, 4 percentage points more than men. However, this educational progress has not been expressed in labor participation and in economic participation. And another element mentioned by the report, and this is something that I would like to comment, because tomorrow, the 25th of November, is the International Day for the elimination of violence against women. This is a very bad practice that exists in the region, which is children's marriage or early unions, and 1 out of every 5 girls face this situation, and therefore we are mentioning this idea of a change in the model, a transition towards what we have called the society of care, that puts at the very center what is truly important, and that what provides sustainability to life and the planet, and that it brings together employment policies with the participation of women in dynamic sectors of the economy. And the report has a specific chapter on a sector which is a key sector, and that is science, technology, innovation, and mathematics, and also mentions that labor policies are not enough if they don't go hand in hand, as mentioned by the report, with educational policies, fiscal policies that expand and deepen rights, labor rights, and of course also comprehensive care systems. And in that sense, as mentioned by the executive secretary, we come from the 15th regional conference on women, where countries of the region have entered into the commitment of making a definite effort in terms of building the societies of care and developing care policies and measures. And if we don't develop this co-responsibility, this social co-responsibility involving men as allies, and a co-responsibility that also involves the state, with greater presence of the state in care policies, we will be losing that gender bond and that tremendous talent that women in the region have, and that is not being expressed in the labor market or in innovation and in other strategic sectors of the economy that are fundamental. Thank you. Thank you, Director of the Gender Division of ECLAC. I would like to apologize to the colleagues that have sent us their very interesting concerns using the digital platforms. And we would like to say that despite the fact that in view of time, we will not be able to answer the questions today, we will be answering in writing the concerns and questions that have been sent by Yolanda Morales, Francisca Bahamondes, Laura Martinez from Universidad de Costa Rica, from Correo Brasilense, Maria Pastrán from El Salvador, Arturo Contreras from Mexico, M. Padilla from Tegucigalpa, Honduras, Ginal Chingua from Santiago, Paula Santibáñez from Valor Futuro, Chile, Marianela Costa from OI, Dominican Republic, Leticia Hernández from the Diario Financiero, plus possibly other colleagues that in the last few minutes have sent their questions. We will be answering all of them in writing in the next few hours. Executive Secretary, before closing this press conference and this launch of the 2022 Social Panorama for Latin America and the Caribbean, I would like to offer you the floor for your closing remarks. Yes, thank you. First of all, I would like to reiterate my gratitude for your interest in this document, both to the people, the journalists that are present here, and for those that are connected virtually. 2 or 3 points. I would like to remind you that this is an extraordinary context. We have a graph that we haven't shown you, which is not part of this report, which reveals that the average growth rate estimated as based on 2014, including the 1.4 that we expect to grow in 2023 in Latin America, will only be 0.8%. We're talking of the last decade, lost in the 80s, when in that decade the rate of growth was 2% on average. So this is an even a decade which is even worse than the lost decade. And that helps us to understand the depths of this issue. We don't have the engines for growth that help us to reduce informality, reduce poverty, reduce inequality, produce more employment, and so on. And therefore, we call upon ambitious policies, consensus, and covenants is not something superficial, but it's something very profound. Because as for ECLAC, we are convinced that that is what Latin American countries require. They need to try to overcome political differences and share those visions and agreements and advance together, because what we had prior to the pandemic and the major risk now as a result of this cascade of crises is these stresses in social governance and these fractures, which are very real. So this involves overcoming those fractures, working on those gaps that have been inherited, and also working on the new ones. And there is a virtuous cycle here that involves, well, in this whole social panorama that we have presented, which is of great concern because the figures don't move in the directions that we would like. This strong message of social policies, but what is also important is social economic reactivation growth, because that will open up spaces. The control of inflation will also be fundamental, and a whole series of inclusive policies, and also work on the institutional quality, and to safeguard that there is no reduction in social expenditure. Governments face a very difficult situation because on the one hand, it is important. This could have a tremendous impact when it comes to these episodes of macroeconomic instability. If we stop paying the debt and so on, those would be very severe episodes that could aggravate the situation. And therefore, being able to manage the financial situation, the fiscal space, with a tremendous priority on social issues and on educational aspects. And that is why we call it the silent social crisis. But what will not be silent and what will be very visible are the scars if we don't resolve that in the next few decades. So thank you very much, and we sincerely thank you for helping us to disseminate these results, because you are a key role in this discussion on public policies and the awareness that citizens may have on about the situation and possible solutions. So thank you very much. Thank you, Executive Secretary. Thus, we conclude the launch of this document and the press conference, and we express our gratitude to our colleagues that have accompanied us in the launch of these ideas of ECLAC. And in our website, you have the document. You will find the document and the presentation delivered by our Executive Secretary, and all supplementary elements that will enable you to provide an adequate coverage. So, Executive Secretary, directors of ECLAC, colleagues from the press and colleagues from ECLAC that have accompanied us, thank you very much, and we will soon meet again in the launch of a new document from ECLAC. Thank you very much.